welcome to reformed thinking. So, I want you to imagine a person who feels just like crushing, agonizing guilt every single time they tell a lie.
Right, the kind of guilt that keeps you up at night.
Yeah, they lose sleep over it, their stomach ties itself in knots, and, they can recount every time they deceived a friend. It makes them physically ill.
But then they wake up the next morning and just keep right on lying.
Yes, that is the kicker. But for centuries, our culture has operated on this very specific assumption about a person like that.
We assume that if they feel terrible, they must have a good heart.
Spot on. We mistake the internal alarm bell for a functioning fire engine. We assume that a working conscience is the identical same thing as a virtuous soul.
It is an incredibly easy assumption to make, though, because the symptoms look so similar from the outside.
Oh, totally.
When we see someone experiencing remorse, we naturally categorize that as evidence of goodness. We think we're looking at a clear diagnostic X-ray of their character.
Right.
But human morality does not offer clean lines or simple binaries. The diagnostic landscape of the human heart is, well, it's murky, and the metrics we use to judge ourselves are often completely unreliable.
That brings us to our focus for this deep dive into the source material. We are unpacking an essay by the 18th century theologian Jonathan Edwards.
Yes, a really fascinating text.
It is a specific section titled Of Natural Conscience in the Moral Sense, which is pulled from his much larger work on the nature of true virtue.
And our mission today is to completely dismantle that common misunderstanding about guilt and goodness.
We are going to look at how Edwards completely separates these two concepts. He makes a staggering case that the guilt you feel or your innate sense of justice is actually driven by self-love.
Yeah, it is not driven by genuine goodness at all, which is a tough pill to swallow.
It really is. The way Edwards diagnoses human psychology in this text from the 1700s is just brilliant. It reads like a modern psychological profile.
It really does. We're going to map out his entire argument piece by piece.
We will look at the internal mechanics of the conscience, and we will examine why it mimics true virtue so convincingly that it fools almost everyone.
And we will look into how a person can possess a flawless moral compass while remaining completely devoid of actual goodness.
So let's start with the psychological root of the issue.
Okay.
Before we can grasp why conscience is distinct from true virtue, we have to isolate what actually causes that uneasy feeling we identify as guilt.
Right. What is the engine there?
Edwards introduces the concept of the natural conscience as a principle that arises entirely from self-love. He uses the term self-union.
The mechanism here is fascinating because it completely reorients how we view our own internal alarms.
Yeah.
He argues that humans possess a natural disposition to feel uneasy when they are inconsistent with themselves.
This internal friction is the engine of the natural conscience, right?
Yes. Edwards explains that this friction occurs when we do something to another person that we would be furious about if it were done to us. He defines this mechanism as a private principle. A private principle is simply an inclination to agree with ourselves, to maintain our own internal comfort and consistency.
Okay, and he contrasts that, right?
He contrasts this private principle sharply with true virtue, which he defines as a public and divine principle.
Wow.
True virtue is a union of the heart with all beings and with God himself. It is an outward-facing love.
Whereas the natural conscience is an inward-facing preservation tactic.
Precisely.
I think we need to linger on that distinction, because guilt is almost universally framed as a noble trait in modern society.
Oh, absolutely.
If you do something terrible and feel awful about it, people will comfort you by saying that your guilt proves you are a good person.
At least you feel bad about it.
Yeah. But Edwards traces that terrible feeling of guilt right back to basic self-preservation.
All about the self.
When you harm someone else, you unconsciously swap places with them in your mind. Because you love yourself so fiercely, imagining that specific harm happening to you causes an immediate psychological rebellion. Your mind recoils at the thought of being treated that way.
That recoil is what Edwards calls an inward war.
Yeah, that's a great term for it. An inward war.
You are actively choosing to commit an action, let's say betraying a friend's trust, while simultaneously rejecting the idea of that betrayal being done to you.
And because your self-love is the dominant force in your life, doing wrong creates a violent internal clash.
You are effectively disagreeing with yourself.
Yes. You are choosing to execute an action that your own self-love utterly condemns. It is a state of severe internal dissonance.
You know, this makes me think of a computer experiencing a fatal logic error.
Oh, okay. Walk me through that.
Imagine you are writing a program and you code a machine to completely reject a specific command under all circumstances.
Yeah.
It is a hardwired rule in the system to refuse that command.
Right.
But then you force the system to execute that very same command anyway.
The system crashes.
Yes, the system crashes. It cannot hold two completely contradictory states at the same time. The operating system just fails.
That makes a lot of sense. Guilt is essentially the human operating system crashing due to a logic error created by our own self-love.
We cannot maintain internal peace when our actions contradict our own demands for how we should be treated.
The concept of a system crash captures the mechanics of natural conscience so well.
It really does. The uneasiness, the sleepless nights, the anxiety of guilt that is the crash.
You just can't hold both realities comfortably.
You cannot love yourself, demand fair treatment for yourself, and then treat others unfairly without causing a malfunction in your own psychological software.
What is so striking about Edwards' analysis is how this reorients our understanding of everyday human behavior.
It really does. If you take this framework and apply it to something as simple as an everyday apology, the implications are actually quite uncomfortable.
Oh, for sure.
It forces you to question the motivation behind saying you are sorry.
When we apologize to someone we have wronged, are we doing it because we genuinely love that person and care about their flourishing?
Or are we just trying to resolve our own internal software crash so we can feel comfortable in our own heads again?
Wow. It forces a severe reevaluation of human motivation.
If the primary driver of the natural conscience is avoiding internal inconsistency, then an apology driven entirely by the conscience is essentially an exercise in self-soothing.
You just want the uneasy feeling to stop.
You want the alarm bells to turn off. True virtue, operating in Edwards' framework, would motivate an apology out of a genuine, selfless love for the other person's well-being.
And that love operates independently of your own internal discomfort.
The natural conscience seeks peace for the self. True virtue seeks the good of the other. They look identical from the outside, but their root motivations are entirely different.
So if this internal logic error relies entirely on putting ourselves in another person's shoes, we have to look at how Edwards explains that mental leap.
Right, how do we actually pull off that swap in our heads?
It feels automatic, but Edwards breaks down the process. He notes that we conceive of what others feel, their love, their pain, their desires, only by recalling our own conscious experiences and substituting ourselves into their place.
He is highly specific about how this happens.
Yeah, he points out that this mental substitution occurs habitually, spontaneously, and instantaneously.
It is so seamless and rapid that most people cannot even give a rational account of doing it.
We use our own mental states as the raw material to build our understanding of everyone else in the world.
We do not have direct access to anyone else's consciousness, so we borrow from our own historical data to imagine their reality.
The text even takes this a step further and applies this mechanism to how we form our concept of God.
That part is fascinating.
Edwards says we take our own internal experiences of understanding, of volition, of love, we remove the limits and imperfections, and we ascribe those elevated traits to the Creator.
We simply have no other way to conceive of any mind, whether human or divine, except by starting with our own consciousness as the baseline.
We take the ideas we obtain through our own internal experiences and transfer them.
It is the only conceptual vocabulary we possess.
Wait, hold on. I am getting stuck here.
Okay, what's the hang-up?
This sounds like a massive philosophical trap.
How so?
Well, if my entire understanding of other people's pain and even my entire understanding of God's mind is just a modified projection of my own personal feelings, aren't I just trapping myself in a hall of mirrors?
I see where you're going.
How is this not just infinite narcissism? If God is just a scaled-up version of my own consciousness, how does Edwards avoid the trap of just creating God in our own image?
That is an incredibly astute pushback, and it gets to the heart of the theological challenge here.
Good, I'm glad I'm not the only one seeing that.
Edwards anticipates this trap. He addresses it by stating that while we must use our consciousness as the raw data because we literally have nothing else to work with, we must actively deny limits and remove changeableness when ascribing these traits to God.
Deny limits.
Right. We use the building blocks of human consciousness, but we scale them to infinity.
Okay, give me an example of that.
For example, we know what knowledge is because we experience knowing things in our daily lives. To conceive of God's knowledge, We take our concept of knowing, strip away our ignorance, strip away our capacity to forget, strip away our need to learn over time, and we arrive at omniscience.
Oh, I see.
We know what love is. We take that concept, strip away our selfishness, our fickleness, our conditions, and we arrive at divine benevolence.
It is wild how modern this all sounds.
It really is ahead of its time.
Centuries before cognitive science mapped out empathy and developed the theory of mind, Edwards identified that empathy is essentially rapid-fire unconscious simulation.
Yes. He recognized that to engage with the moral weight of an action, we run a lightning-fast simulation in our minds where we are the recipient of the action.
He is describing the precise psychological mechanism that researchers study today.
Mirror neurons and cognitive empathy rely on this very process of internal simulation. We construct a model of another person's mind using our own mind as the template.
Think about watching a video of someone stubbing their toe on a piece of furniture.
Ouch. Yeah?
You immediately wince, but you wince not because you physically feel their nerve endings firing.
Right. You have no connection to their nervous system.
Instead, your brain instantaneously downloads your own past memory of toe stubbing, pastes that memory onto the other person, and creates a sympathetic shock in your own body.
You are experiencing a simulation of their pain based entirely on your own historical data.
And it all happens in a fraction of a second.
And that rapid-fire simulation is the absolute groundwork for the moral judgments we make.
Which leads us into the next major section of Edwards' thought.
He outlines two distinct ways the natural conscience uses those projections to judge right and wrong.
He builds a framework based on two pillars of conscience.
The first pillar is what we were just talking about. The disposition to approve or disapprove of treatment based on self-consistency.
It is the psychological mechanism behind the golden rule.
Yes. You feel uneasy when you treat someone in a way you would hate to be treated because you are running that internal simulation of their pain.
That first pillar is entirely about personal feeling.
It is about avoiding internal friction and maintaining your own psychological comfort.
But the second pillar operates on a completely different frequency. Edwards calls it a sense of desert.
This is a natural recognition of the agreement, proportion, and harmony between certain actions and their reactions.
So if the first pillar is an emotional alarm bell triggered by self-love, the second pillar feels much more mathematical.
Yes, it is a recognition of moral physics.
The conscience sees that if someone causes an injury, justice demands an equal and opposite reaction.
It demands resentment and punishment.
Conversely, if someone shows extraordinary kindness, there is a natural agreement that they should be rewarded.
Every action requires a proportionate reaction to keep the universe balanced.
It is entirely about symmetry. The natural conscience possesses an inherent appreciation for order.
It craves a balanced scale. Edwards argues that the conscience approves of God's judgments because it recognizes the sheer logic of them.
It is a matter of proportion.
Since we receive absolutely everything from the Creator, our lives, our breath, our provision, it is perfectly proportionate and uniform that we owe supreme respect and obedience back to Him.
Opposing the infinite creator logically deserves infinite opposition. The math just works.
Let's use an analogy to clarify this sense of desert.
Okay.
Imagine an auditor sitting in a sterile room looking at a massive spreadsheet for a corporation. The auditor's entire job is to ensure the columns balance out.
They look at the ledger and see that a massive debt has been incurred, but then they see a corresponding payment that zeroes out the account.
And the auditor feels a sense of satisfaction. The ledger is clean, the math is perfect.
But approving of the math on a spreadsheet is an entirely different reality from joyfully taking your own money out of your own wallet and donating it to charity.
Yes. One is an appreciation for cold symmetry. The other is true virtue.
That distinction is the hinge upon which Edwards' entire argument swings.
You can intensely appreciate the symmetry of a balanced ledger without possessing a single drop of generosity in your heart.
In the very same way, your natural conscience can appreciate the symmetry of divine justice without possessing a single drop of true virtue.
The conscience loves the order. The virtuous heart loves the goodness itself.
If we expand on this, you can clearly see how our entire societal justice system operates almost exclusively on this sense of desert.
It has to, right?
The law requires a proportionate punishment for a crime to satisfy the public's natural conscience.
When someone commits a heinous crime and receives a remarkably light sentence, society is universally outraged.
Why? Because the math is wrong. The ledger does not balance.
The natural conscience demands an equal weight placed on the other side of the scale to restore the harmony of justice.
Society absolutely relies on that mechanism to function.
God instituted the natural conscience, complete with its demand for symmetry, to maintain order in a fallen world.
It restrains evil, it builds legal systems, it keeps civilization from tearing itself apart.
But because this mathematical sense of justice can perfectly align with God's law on paper, it is incredibly easy to mistake a functioning conscience for a virtuous heart.
That perfectly sets up what Edwards viewed as the catastrophic error of his era.
Because this mathematical spreadsheet of justice works so efficiently to keep society functioning, it completely blinded the thinkers of his day.
They looked at this system and made a massive misdiagnosis about human nature.
Edwards dedicates a huge portion of his essay to calling out the moralists and philosophers who looked at human empathy and the conscience and drew the absolute wrong conclusion.
The leading moralists of the 18th century argued that the universal moral sense in mankind was hard evidence of a naturally implanted, truly benevolent temper.
They observed the fact that humans generally approve of kindness, that we build justice systems, and that we disapprove of cruelty.
From these observations, they concluded that humanity is inherently good at its core.
They confused the restraining of evil with the presence of genuine holiness.
Edwards steps in to completely dismantle that conclusion.
He argues that the natural conscience can approve of true virtue. It can look at justice and appreciate its uniformity without ever actually tasting its primary and essential beauty.
He uses highly specific sensory language there, tasting versus seeing.
The natural conscience sees the logic. True virtue tastes the sweetness of benevolence.
I want to spend some time on that specific phrasing because it is such a vivid, striking distinction.
They're brilliant.
What does it actually mean to taste the sweetness of virtue versus just seeing the logic of it?
How do we identify the difference in our own lives?
Yeah, how do we know which one is operating in us?
Edwards answers this by pointing back to the fundamental distinction between private and divine principles.
True virtue, as he defines it, is a union of heart to being in general.
It loves goodness for what it is in itself, not for how it balances the scales or maintains societal order.
Tasting the sweetness means you actively desire the good of others, and you desire the glory of God as an end in itself.
You find unshakable joy in it.
Seeing the logic simply means you recognize that benevolence makes the system run smoothly and keeps you out of trouble.
To prove this, he offers an argument that I find totally devastating.
Lay it on me.
He points out that if conscience and a virtuous heart were the precise same thing, then a person's level of guilt would perfectly match their level of holiness.
Remorse would equal repentance.
Right. The worse you feel about your actions, the closer to God you would be.
If the moralists of his day were right, then guilt is a sanctifying force.
But Edwards points out that this is demonstrably false in everyday human experience.
You see this dynamic so clearly in the tragedy of addiction, or even just persistent destructive habits.
A person caught in addiction often sins against immense, blinding light.
They know full well what they are doing. Their conscience screams at them at maximum volume.
They wake up the next morning with crushing, terrible remorse.
They can clearly see the destruction they are causing to their own bodies, the pain they are inflicting on their families, and the ruin of their careers.
The math of their failure is completely obvious to them. The ledger is entirely in the red.
Yet, despite seeing all of this with perfect clarity, their heart's desire remains completely unchanged.
The massive divergence between their crushing guilt and their continuing actions proves Edwards' point entirely.
Seeing the math of your failure does not change your appetite.
The conscience can be fully awake, fully operational, and completely accurate at its assessment, while the heart remains totally hostile to virtue.
A person can hate the consequences of their actions, they can hate the internal friction and the psychological pain of their guilt.
And yet they can still completely love the sin itself.
They desperately want the uneasiness to stop, but they have absolutely no desire to become holy.
That brings us to the final, ultimate proof Edwards offers.
To completely shatter the idea that a perfect conscience equals a good heart, he fast-forwards to the end of human history.
He presents a flawless theological stress test centered on the day of judgment.
It is the ultimate testing ground for his theory of the conscience.
Edwards argues that on the future day of judgment, God will set every sinner's deeds in perfect order before them.
There will be no hidden variables, no missing context, and no room for debate.
The text says that all stupidity of conscience will end.
Every rationalization, every excuse, every blind spot we use to justify our actions will be stripped away.
Their consciences will be fully awakened to reality, and they will see the undeniable justice of their sentence.
Edward says they will actually join the judge in condemning themselves.
Their sense of desert will be functioning at absolute, flawless perfection.
They will see the infinite greatness of God.
They will see their infinite obligation to him as creatures who received everything from his hand.
And they will clearly see that their lifelong rebellion warrants an infinite punishment.
The ledger will be perfectly clear, and the math will be undeniably correct.
They will appreciate the symmetry of the justice being handed down.
This is where the paradox hits hardest.
If conscience were the same thing as virtue, this moment of perfect moral clarity would mean they're perfectly holy.
If knowing the good equals doing the good, and if agreeing with justice equals loving justice, then a fully awakened conscience at the judgment seat would instantly turn every sinner into a saint.
The mere influx of perfect information would cure the disease of the heart.
But that does not happen.
Edwards points out that instead of being changed by this perfect clarity, they will be given up to their wickedness.
They will become like devils.
Their sin and hostility will rage like an unrestrained fire, even as their own internal conscience fully agrees with the punishment they are receiving.
That is a staggering scenario to try and comprehend.
We usually operate under the assumption that if someone truly understands the gravity of their wrongdoings, they will soften.
They will break down, they will repent, and they will change.
We base our entire restorative justice system on this idea.
But Edwards paints a picture where perfect intellectual understanding and perfect hatred coexist in the absolute same mind forever.
It is the starkest possible demonstration of his thesis.
A person can possess 100% moral clarity alongside 0% moral goodness.
The sinners at the judgment see the greatness of the being they rebelled against. They recognize their obligations.
They see the precise, flawless proportion of their punishment.
Yet, possessing all of that knowledge, they do not have a single drop of benevolent temper.
They have no love for God's beauty. They see the light, but they hate the light.
I want to think about the implications of this for you, the listener, in your day-to-day life.
It gets very personal.
We live in an era that worships information. We constantly seek more data, assuming that if we just know better, we will inevitably do better.
We buy books on habit formation. We listen to deep dives. We gather endless data on how to be better people.
We think that ignorance is our only real problem.
But Edwards argues that information and conviction are completely separate mechanisms from a renewal of the heart's actual desires.
You can have all the conviction in the world and remain entirely unchanged.
It forces a massive reevaluation of our own spiritual state.
We can no longer rely on the fact that we feel bad about our mistakes as a hard evidence that our hearts are right.
We cannot point to our ability to spot injustice in the world or our outrage over political corruption as proof of our own inherent goodness.
The natural conscience is a brilliant, necessary mechanism given by God to keep the world from descending into absolute chaos. But it cannot save you.
It cannot regenerate a heart. It cannot make you love God.
Let's synthesize everything we have covered today, because we have walked through a massive amount of psychological and theological ground.
The core takeaway from Edwards' essay is this. The natural conscience is a mechanism born of self-love.
It seeks internal consistency to avoid psychological pain, and it seeks mathematical justice to maintain harmony in the world.
It can perfectly identify right and wrong. It could even fully agree with the rigorous demands of the law of God.
But it cannot produce true virtue.
True virtue is an actual love and taste for goodness itself, independent of self-preservation.
I want to bring this directly to your own experience. Think about the last time you felt a sharp pang of guilt, or the last time you felt a surge of righteous indignation about a headline you read.
Pause and look under the hood of your own mind.
Are you reacting out of a genuine love for what is good? Do you possess a true union of heart with God and your fellow human beings?
Or are you just trying to quiet the uncomfortable alarms of your own self-preservation?
Are you just acting like an auditor, demanding that the spreadsheet of the universe balances out so you can feel comfortable?
It strips away all of the comforting illusions we hold about our own righteousness.
We have to look past the superficial X-ray of our working conscience and examine the actual desires running underneath.
Which leaves us with a final thought to chew on, long after the audio stops today.
We started this conversation by talking about the murky waters of human morality and the broken diagnostic X-ray of guilt.
Edwards has handed us a much sharper lens to scan our own motives.
But it raises a highly unsettling question. If our internal moral compass can flawlessly point to true north, while our actual desires and actions actively run south,
How can we ever trust our own motivations when we do the right thing?
does genuine goodness require us to completely forget ourselves?